So welcome to today's training session. Today we'll be going over Midnight's reports handling module. We'll be taking a deeper look at it compared to our past session to have a little bit of a better understanding on how to set up some sorts, filters, and other modifiers in reports, as well as a few mathematical operations, a brief explanation of how to organize and change text or other bits of info that you see on the screen to render differently when printing. And finally, going over a couple of steps necessary for making sure that exports, say, to either CSV or to Excel properly format when you actually push them out. Before we get too far into this, I will go over a couple of key elements from our prior session. In the admin module, to start things off, you'll see under the global settings that we have a controller for reports. In this controller, you have the ability to identify a signature, which is a company-based signature, not a user-based one. We also have a default BCC address, which doubles as a method of being able to store outgoing emails in a server related to your own, say, Exchange or Microsoft Outlook server. Midnight does not actually store outgoing emails, but this is a way that you can use the outgoing email functionality to track and log what's actually being pushed out of Midnight and sent to your customers. Finally, the Enable Role-Based Security on Reports checkbox, if enabled, allows you to pick and choose which security roles are allowed to view which specific reports. This is a fairly recent add-on, and this allows you to define security rules to either allow or deny users the right to be able to see reports that they shouldn't be able to see, such as a sales rep viewing any accounting or sales-based reports. All of this can be controlled in the admin report objects list and in the security list. In the report objects list, what you'll see in here is the list of the reports that you have active or inactive in Midnight. By default, you'll see all active reports as indicated by the active yes column. In here, you'll see the report name and display name columns. The report name is a term used to identify a report as being a unique object in our system. The display name is what you actually see the report titled as. So when creating a report, you'll want to make sure that you name the display name as you need, so that way it makes sense visually, as opposed to having a different backend name, which is something that we here at Virtual Systems would be using. One easy case to identify this is the customer details report. You'll see the display name has a space separating the words, whereas the report name does not. In addition, you have the ability to tell your report that when loading, it should show all pages by default. If you edit your row, you can check this box to enable that feature. What this does is it allows a report that has either 2, 3, 4, any more than 1 pages to display all pages in a complete vertical scroll view. Do bear in mind that this means your report is immediately rendering more information than it would at default. So your report may take a bit longer to load if you have this enabled. It won't be an issue for reports like invoices that rarely go over 2 or 3 pages. But for a sales report, customer list report, or other report that could go into the dozens of pages, you may see some lag when trying to render that many report pages. We also have the attach file as controller. When sending an email out of Midnight, if you attach a report to that email straight from Midnight, then that attachment is given a name. You can control the name of the attachment by modifying the name here. A common scenario of this would be if you were, say, updating an invoice report. You'll see I have many invoices here. Your customer may not need to understand or see that this report is, say, titled Invoice Price Version Summary for the attachment name. In this case, you could simply delete the rest, leave attached file as set to invoice, and then the attachment on the outgoing email would be titled invoice with an underscore separating that from the actual order number. Lastly, jump into our security handler under the security create role write options. You'll see that we have the reports listed as blue. You can click this to be brought to a pop-up where you can check reports that you want to be considered locked out for that particular account. And of course, to undo it, you can simply do the opposite, check the boxes, hit remove, and hit save and close to commit. Do be sure that after you do that, you click the submit button for the employee security role type. Otherwise, the changes that you just made in the admin menus pop out won't actually stick. So that's the gist of our process. We'll jump into our reports and take a look at some modifications that we'll be making, which differ from the typical sense of report creation. To start things off, I'll jump into a sales report. We'll see in this case that we have our information columned out as such, and if we run our report for a longer period of time, the info may not necessarily display in the way that we would expect it to. For instance, perhaps we want the text larger, or maybe we simply want to omit some of the columns. You can also notice here that under the finishing department, I've got two dollar signs. So there are quite a few little fixes we can do to this report to streamline its effectiveness. As always, I'll start by going to the Create Report button, then selecting the report from our Clone From list. This creates a new report. The reason we always want to do this is because our stock reports will always be updated during a patch release that goes out over, say, a weekend or at the end of a month. When this happens, then you're brought to a scenario in which your work on a stock report would be overwritten with what we would forcibly acknowledge as the stock report's update. Our update processes do not touch custom reports, so you don't need to worry about us deleting your data if you modify a report that you yourself created. I'll simply title my report Sales Report 2 for now. Now in the report, we can begin to make simple changes. Now in here, we'll see that we have several different bands. These bands form a simple hierarchy in which they display in a certain formatted order to determine what actually appears on the report. To start, I'll right-click and create a new page to demonstrate. You have your page headers and page footers, which appear at the bottom of a page. You then have your report title and report summary bands. Even though the report summary band is listed here towards the top, it does display at the bottom of any other containers that are above it. It also has grouping bands if you'd like to group your data. These grouping bands need to have a type of data to identify what they're consolidating. You can have a footer to indicate the completion of said grouping operation. You can have a data band in the middle, and then this is the data that's actually grouped. And then you have header and footer bands, which are simple text containing bands that you can put just about anywhere. except in between any of the page headers and report titles, or page footers and report summaries. You'll see that I do have a list of bands here on the left. You'll find them all under the actual bands expandable. We're going to find some of the more commonly needed ones over here on the left, down below. So we can see on this page 1 that our report title band is slated to indicate the following information. And then our header band, as a text header, will simply identify how we expect the data to come out afterwards, with mathematical sums here at the bottom. Of course, at the bottom of the report itself, we have a page footer band. Before we get into the mathematical operations and data changes, I'm going to identify one more thing we can do to streamline our report design process. The report itself has property panels that can be accessed for just about everything. As you click it, you'll see the properties for everything that you select. Pretty much results in a different properties list. Oftentimes you'll see lines, and these lines can be fitted in specific locations by selecting one of the line tools here, either the horizontal or vertical line. One thing to bear in mind is that these may not scale properly with your text containers. So in handling lines around containers, it may more often than not be beneficial to actually select the container and apply a border to it. In this case, instead of this line right here, I'll delete this, select all my containers, and apply a top border to them. Also raise it a little bit and tell all of my text to appear at the bottom. So that way everything formats itself properly, and we have virtually no difference between the behavior of our original line and our containers here. You can do this with your bands as well as the text containers. For instance, this line here on the page footer band doesn't quite look like it's on center. We can see over here on the top, under the properties list, that it's not zeroed to be right at the top of the footer. I'll delete this. Oops. And then when I click the page footer, I can apply a top border. And I have a border here, which as I move the container or expand or contract its height, the top border moves with it. So I've got nothing to worry about in terms of rendering issues. You'll also notice that we have a grid in our background. You can control whether the grid exists or not by entering the the page tab. Clicking to show the grid or align your boxes to the grid, or even modify if the grid is dotted or full lines. The convenience of having a grid means that you give yourself the option to use the Layouts Align to Grid feature. When you select a container, it may not necessarily be lined up edge to edge for its other grid components. If you click the Align to Grid button, you'll see how it will move, and it will also resize itself to be brought to the nearest full increment based on the grid that's being used. This can be done for containers like the bands, or it can be done for containers simply just for text. And this align feature gives you the ability to align containers or multiple containers in reference to each other. For instance, if I want to align these two text boxes, I'll select them, hit align to top, and you'll see that they're both moved in tandem with each other. This quickly allows me to modify the size of our footer to make sure that we're maximizing the space on our page with text containers that fit just largely enough for what we want them to do. We'll do the same here at the top. We'll select our containers, align them to the grid to make sure they're spaced in properly, and move them as we need. Now, one key difference between our bands is that our report title band differs in behavior from our page header band in that by default, the report title band only appears one time per section that it's designated to appear in, where the page header band by default appears on the top of any page, regardless of what is inside of it. This is useful for instances that require you to, say, have a page number on each page, which you can see down here in our footer band is already set. However, it does cause issues if we want to, say, have our sales report title and our date period both at the top of the report versus on the top of every page of the report. The page header band does give us flexibility to turn that feature off. You'll see that when selected, we have the print on all pages option by default selected. We can change this so that way it only appears on the first page. And then this causes it to behave almost identically to the report title band. In this case, you can theoretically have multiple page bands established. And as long as they're set up properly, they won't conflict with each other or appear to duplicate information. Now to the data itself. If we had viewed our report earlier, or if we preview it within here, we can adjust the search criteria to meet our needs and show us the information that we need to see. If we need to change how the data is sorted, viewed, filtered, or calculated, we can do a lot of that from the data band itself. If we double click the the dark blue part of the data band, we're brought to a container where we can pick and choose and change the source of which the data itself is controlled. We can also modify the sort conditions. For instance, telling it to sort by company name, or perhaps we'll tell it to sort by order number instead. And if you wish to add sorts, then you can to have different levels of sort. For instance, sorting by company name, and then by all orders. And then if projects happen to be shared within an order, you can sort by project name or by date. You can then remove these by clicking and using the up arrows or down arrows to relocate them, or by clicking the remove box to fully remove it from your sort controller. You'll see now that while our data band is still selected, our sort list here on the priorities panel has been updated to show what our new sort is. We could do the same thing to get into our filter controller by double clicking the data band and clicking filters. Or we can click the filter row and drill into it to be brought immediately to the filter list. There's two different ways to get to the same place. So whichever preference works for you, feel free to use it. In here, you can add your filters for conditional statements, such as do not show information if, say, the total of sales happens to be a certain amount, or say if the company has a name that is equal to or contains certain pieces of information. One common scenario in this is if you want a sales report to show sales for specific types of jobs. In this case, I may set it so only show information if my numeric value of this data column is greater than 0. You can add other conditions by clicking Add Filter and have them work in an and/or statement. For instance, show data if this or that is true, or show data if this and that are true. Usable for, say, if you want to sort and filter out data for, say, printed jobs that are shipped via FedEx. And then one of your departments here may include services that include FedEx shipment. Or you could do show all jobs that, say, have a total of print sales greater than 0 and also were larger than 100-piece jobs. Two different ways to achieve information that meets your needs. And as we saw in the sort thing, we can remove these as necessary by clicking the Remove Filter option to actually pull it from our list. Now, if we run a report under our preview list, we'll take a quick peek and see what we get. As I have a snapshot here, we'll run a filter identifier to control whether or not we have print sales on orders or not. In this example, we can see that all of our jobs here are print jobs. If I were to return to our filter and either remove it or disable it by unchecking the Filter On button, when we rerun the report and run it for the same criteria, we can see already that our second job has $0 for print, which was not part of our original or modification that we placed in for the filter. Now, one other thing we can do is make modifications to the math or the displayed text information that comes on the report. For instance, if you have info on your dates and you want to change how they display, you can see how we have our dates listed here in month, month, date, date, and then 4-year format. If you click the cell itself, you'll find that oftentimes we have two different ways of formatting applied to your dates already. You can either double-click into it and modify the expression with a string conversion, or you can click under the text format of the selected cell to change it to a date format, expand the options list, and then pick and choose from the format how you would like it to actually appear. Alternatively, from here, you can go into Custom and actually create your own method that falls within the criteria of our current data listing to make it show up how you need. We'll try month, month, date, date, year, year, and see what we get. That didn't work. That would be because our data here in the column itself is identified as a text string rather than a date value, like here in our date of service versus our V date of service. If I change our expression in here by deleting and reselecting from our column list the date of service, or if I were to simply under the data column, double click the date of service, that would be the contents of our new cell. Now if we check preview, we'll see that we have different formatting applied because the format controller in the header is modifying the specific type of text that's being brought into the report in the way that we want it to. And to go one step further, we see that we have mathematical operations here. In the cells, you can apply math and give specific formatting commands to the cells that you're actually doing the math with. For instance, we'll have our sales report total of category 1 or service type 1 available within our sales report list. You'll see right here. This has been given the command to sum all instances above it and then format it to show as a currency value out to 2 digits beyond by force, even if it were to say be rounded out to the nearest dollar. There are a handful of mathematical operations that we can apply here. You can actually see several of them in the report by going to the functions list, expanding out the math, or expanding out the totals, and just taking a look at some of the ones that exist. If you double click the element that you want to add in, and then in parentheses, put all of the pieces that you want mathematically calculated based on the operation in front. Make sure to put the contents of all elements within the parentheses. And then at the end, if you need to format it in a certain way or apply any other logical operations, use a period and then fill in the next operation, such as the string conversion statement. One place we can see this already in action is under our totals list, where in here we have the sum of all of our different sales instances set to be formatted to a string of currency or currency format. There are some other things we can do here, and we can go straight into the dictionary to get to them. If we click into functions, we can go to totals. In this case, I'll click and drag in count. I'll double click in here, and I'll add in a data source for our order IDs. I'll make this red just so it stands out. And if I check the preview of our report, let's see, we're brought to an issue. That may not work. Give me just a moment. All right, we'll skip this part for now. To get back on track, we'll see we have all sorts of mathematical commands over here on the right, some of which giving minimums and maximums, some of which include truncation to handle how we round our text and calculated values. And then we also have string commands like removing, replacing, or position counting to actually give us specific formatting as we need it. We'll experiment with a few of these, and then I'll link a guide for you to experiment with on your own. I'll start by copying the print type 4 service type code. I'll make this red so it stands out. I'll double click into here, remove a few of the other options. And instead of doing the flat sum of this, I'm going to update this so that way it shows the currency as words. You see we have quite a few options here like decimals, booleans, long statements, and such. You can click and drag these in, and then command the text to format just as you would expect in other ways by putting it within parentheses and then having the most outward operation be the final step that takes place. So working backwards, we have the sales for category 4 being summed and then converted to words. Let's see if this works. The currency to words may seem like a value that doesn't necessarily matter as often for an operational step, but you'll find that there are some key statements in here that really do make a difference in how they get used. One great way to handle this sort of step is to, instead of modifying a numeric value, use any of our text string handlers to modify either job name or company name values. You'll see how I have my company here listed, 5Z's Designs. In cases in which you don't need all of that information, there are ways to get around that. You can apply to the expression a simple command, like a string for showing a count from the left, and how far in you'd like to count. In this case now, if I run the report, we'll see that we're shrinking the amount of data that we see, which would theoretically give us more space to fit other information, such as more columns of data, without completely omitting some of the necessary numbers, names, or text values that we would need to see in these cases. Instead of using a system to control how many characters we see, we can also do something to flat out replace the text that we see. By using a period to separate the command between our data column and our replace command, we can tell the system to replace or remove text that we don't care to see by using two instances of quotes separated by a comma to indicate an operation of a replacement. Again, referring to my 5Z's Designs company, I can remove designs and replace it with, in this case, nothing. So that way when the reports run, we only see information of whatever the original would have been. This could be useful for a sales report that is slated to run jobs and have a command and set to omit templates without necessarily hiding them from your full list, so that way you can see what numbers those templates would have brought in. We'll see here I have my template service. By running a preview, we'll run the same criteria and see the template was removed. Now notice how we're running the report for a period of time and we're getting all of our information by department, but we're not getting any information to split by customer. We can use the grouping system to do that and have grouping calculations set for each customer by taking advantage of the report's grouping bands. We put a group header band around the data that we'd like to group, and we give it a category in which how we want it to group. We can then have headers or sum calculations established within each group. I'll take our totals list and move it up to our group band. I'll reset this back to its original state. And I'll copy and paste our company name with a little modification to make it stand out. Now, if we run our report, without selecting a customer from our customer list, we can still have it group by customer and then perform the mathematical operations of the summing for each customer that we run our sorts through. To go one step further, you can use a footer band to run a calculation for everything that's been summed above it. Giving us the ability to sum each customer individually and then have a grand total at the end. Now, to add other pieces to the report that aren't necessarily mathematical or logic-based, you can have a cell itself be modified by adding a condition to it. Conditional statements are a little strange to set up. If we click them and set apply condition or add condition and apply a highlight, this is in essence how you set yourself up to be able to add conditional statements to your text cells. In here, what you would be expected to do is either have a new format applied or disable any reformatting and build in your statement. So that way, depending on whatever criteria you have, your information shows for that cell. For instance, in this case, if the project name contains template, I'll modify this so it stands out by being red and bold. Now if we run a preview on the report, we'll see that we have a little bit of a logical change here This allows us to have some difference in formatting, just know something that's happening. Statements here can be set up in a variety of ways. For instance, if something equals yes, then replace it with a check mark or true, or if something equals no, then replace it with a false. Those can be identified in the Boolean instances. These are commonly set for active checkbox values, yes or no's. Our system recognizes yes/no statements or checked or unchecked as true or false. You likely wouldn't need to see that. However, you may want to replace true with yes and set another one up with false equal to no. And these are commonly referred to for boxes, say active, or if something's actually been shipped, yes or no. So in this report, we may not find too much use for that. The final thing I'll go over on this report is our export procedure. It's easy for a report to not export in a clean and orderly format. We'll reference this in its current formatting as we prepare to push it out to Excel. Noticing that there's a gap here and a gap here between our cells. As we run our data and then run our save export to Excel, we're given the option by default to export to data only, which is my recommended method of formatting and preparing an export. Bearing in mind that this only exports anything from your data band or multiple data bands if you have more than one on a report. In this case, once we run it, we're given a simple column list in our Excel program, but the columns don't necessarily look like they match up with what we'd expect to see. For instance, this blank column here, and this total being askew from the actual total numbers. If we take a close look at our file, we can see that because there is a gap here, that new columns have actually been created. And these translate into Excel, regardless of which format of export you use. If we do an Excel export that is full, then we'll run into a similar scenario with much different column formatting. Noting here this additional column of V and H, presenting strange gaps between everything, as well as anything that causes text wrap, for instance, these longer job names, to create additional thin rows that don't actually have data in them. To get around this, it would make the most sense to set up your reports so that way your text cells are placed edge to edge. This is where the benefit of being able to align your containers to a grid really helps, as you're thus able to select everything and make sure that if it's not aligned just right and snugly against another, that it can be by force by using the grid function to do it all for you. Now, one final step to be aware of when exporting something out to Excel? Well, you can indeed format your text to appear in ways that you want, for instance, as currency by force. If your text cells are not identified as what they need to be, for instance, currency, then when you try to run a summing operation, you won't actually be able to. Excel doesn't take too kindly to outside documentation, formatting, and converting text to numbers. We'll run a quick check here to see that in action. So in this case, as everything's exported just as we expected it to, all these green flags on our cells indicate that they're not text, that are numbers, they're text that are text, recognized by the number or method of formatting up here at the top. If we try to run an auto sum, you'll see that it won't work because we'll need to convert these to currency values or number values before any math can actually happen. In the report itself, if you were to select the cells and modify them as text to currency, and then pick and choose any specific currency rulings that need to exist, for instance, how many places beyond the decimal they go, you can do all that right here. The default is typically what you'll see below, or the local setting. You can adjust this and then have, say, comma separators, different decimal placement, parentheses for negative values, and so on, identified by controlling them all from here. And do note, as you do this, you'll then need to modify the cell itself so that the string command for the formatting controller is removed. We'll see these three for now. Now we run an export and try to update the math to give us a sum. Oops. We'll actually be able to do just that. It comes over formatted a little differently. For instance, there are no $0 and 0 cent values. But everything behaves as we need it to if we are to run a sum. You'll see this for column 1, 2, and 3. But if we try to run the sum for the other values, they still work despite having the flag requesting that you convert it to a number. Finally, our CSV handler is a little different. You can say push out a list of data to a CSV file by going to a data file export, identifying what the separator is, say comma, bar delimited, or whatever you need it to be. As you push this text out, you'll see that you'll be able to open it in Excel and that your column headers won't necessarily match up to what you would expect them to be. This is because the actual cell's header value that's pushed out references a text value on the cell itself rather than the header to define its value. You'll see here, for instance, I have text2 for my customer name. If I click the customer name cell, it's identified as text2. If I scroll down, I can see in design that it's identified as text2. We'll name it customer in this case. We'll resave it and try another export and see how it pushes out. Oops. There are formatting instances that Midnight's report system doesn't take too nicely. Fix that one time here. Give it a unique name. Customer name is not allowed. Very interesting. We'll try one more time. That should work. Now if we export this out to our CSV, we're given the customer name header as we would expect to see it. The final feature I'll go over is something a little risky and something I would almost always suggest not taking part in. However, if necessary, it does work between reports. You can copy and paste both data cells, text panels, or even complete bands worth of data from one report to another. If you jump into a report, highlight or select some containers worth of data, and use Control-C or copy, you can then exit the report, open up another report, and paste it into that one. The reason I would typically not recommend this is that the data calls within each report are specifically built for those reports. You see a great instance of this command here to load the date. And if these values don't exist on the report, then when you attempt to run it, you'll receive errors. For formatting purposes, it is quite helpful. So that way you can make sure that you're copying over consistent bracket sizing or text component dimensions. But in those cases, I would always select all values, click in the text here on the right, properties, and hit enter to remove all elements of text. So that way, if you attempt to run your report, you don't have any errors from trying to run something that's not from this report. So that concludes today's report's advanced level training. There's a little bit more that I can go over. And if you'd like any modifications made to your reports that you didn't see me go over today, let me know. I'll send you some documentation so that way you can try to either interpret and build a report the way that you need it to, or we can jump in and do the report modifications that you need. There's a reports guide listed at this URL here, which allows you to see an explanation of how to use just about every method of report modification there is. But do note that the search filters and the actual data elements themselves that are within the report are not customizable through the front end. What I mean by this is that you cannot change or add new filters for which your report searches by, and you cannot pick and add new elements of data for your report to load. One example of this is our sales report that we just created. Because the report does not have, by default, say the order date or date of entry, there's no way from within the report to add that value. We'll have to do that here on our end. So let us know in an email if you need any of those modifications. If they're quotable or complex enough, we'll let you know if our development team needs to get involved. And we'll get them built in as quickly and effectively as we can based on the time and complexity of the report. Thank you all for attending. And if you need to review this or any other areas of our report training system, either take a closer look at this video once again, playing it slowly, or take a look at our reports basics session to go over some of the more simple elements like proper methods to back up your report before running it and modifying it, or just ways to hide reports that are simply unused.